He was 71 years old at his granddaughter's wedding when the family finally understood, and even then they got it only halfway, because he had spent 50 years making sure no one ever saw the whole of it. The reception was in a hotel ballroom, with a wall of tall windows looking out over a golf course going gold in the evening, and the seating chart put him at the head table, in the place of honor, in a chair with its back to the glass. He did not sit down. He stood behind the chair with his hand on it, smiling, greeting people, and when at last there was no more avoiding it, he leaned to his son and said, quietly, the way a man asks for something he is ashamed to need, that he wondered if they might switch his seat to the other side, where he could put his back to the wall and keep the windows in front of him. His son thought it was about the sunset in his eyes. It was not about the sunset. It was 1968, and it had been 1968 for 50 years, and it would go on being 1968 every time the world opened up into a bright rectangle he could not control. His name was Ray, and when he was 19 he sat in the open door of a helicopter for a living. He was a door gunner on a UH-1, a Huey, the aircraft that is the sound of that entire war, that particular hammering rotor beat that every man who was there can still hear in a certain kind of silence. Ray's job was to sit in the open cargo doorway behind an M60 machine gun, strapped in by a length of webbing the crews called a monkey strap, so he could lean his whole body out into the sky, and to put fire on the tree line while the ship came down into places no sane person would choose to land. He was not enclosed. That is the thing civilians never quite grasp about the door gunners. The infantry had the ground, and the ground had cover. The pilots had a windscreen and instruments and at least the illusion of a machine around them. The door gunner had an open rectangle, and the whole world screaming past it, and everything, the beauty and the killing and the falling and the dead, came to him through that opening, framed, rushing, unstoppable, at 100 knots. He kept one thing from all of it, a single spent shell casing, brass, 7.62 millimeter, one of the tens of thousands his gun threw out over 13 months, and he could not have told you why he picked that particular one up off the aluminum floor of the ship on his last day in country and put it in his pocket. He would keep it for the rest of his life. It lived in a succession of drawers and cigar boxes and, eventually, a small dish on his dresser, and his wife thought it was a keepsake, a souvenir, the kind of thing men brought back. It was not a souvenir. It was the one piece of the door he had been able to carry out. It was proof that the opening had been real, that he had sat in it, that the wind had been that loud. Roughly 5,000 American helicopters were destroyed in Vietnam. That is not a misprint, and it is not the number that served. It is the number that were lost. Most of them Hueys, most of them coming down exactly where Ray sat, in the door, in the open, on the way in or the way out of the places the war needed reaching. The men in those doors did the math without ever being taught it. They understood, in the animal part of themselves, that the door was the seat the enemy aimed for, because the door was where the gun was, and the gun was the thing that had to be killed first. So they leaned out into the fire that was reaching for them specifically, and they fired back, and they watched everything happen through the frame, and the ones who lived came home carrying the frame inside them. If this story matters to you, consider subscribing. Every video here follows one person from the war they were sent to through the long quiet that came after, the decades most of the country never bothered to ask about. This is not a combat story. It is a story about what it does to a man to spend his youth watching the world through an opening he could not close, and then to spend his old age unable to sit with his back to a window. If someone in your family served in the air over that war and never spoke of it, this is partly his story too. Now back to Ray and the chair he would not sit in. Because the wedding was not the first time, of course. It was only the first time the family had all been in the room to see it. The pattern went back to the month he came home, though no one had ever laid the instances side by side long enough to see that they made a shape. The way he always took the booth seat facing the door in a restaurant, which everyone assumed was an ordinary veteran's habit and half joked about. The way he had, over decades, quietly rearranged every house they ever lived in so that no chair he used regularly sat with its back to a large window. The recliner angled just so. The desk moved. The reading lamp on the side of the room that let him keep the glass in view. His wife had noticed the recliner and said nothing, because 40 years of marriage teaches you which of a man's arrangements are not up for discussion. He had a phrase for it. On the rare occasions he said anything at all, and he said it lightly, as a joke, so that it would slide past. "I just like to see what's coming," he'd say. "I just like to see what's coming." He said it so often and so easily that no one ever heard it for what it was, which was the truest thing he knew about himself, and the saddest, and the door of a Huey talking through the mouth of an old man 50 years after the ship went down. The window was never really about windows. It was about the frame, and to understand the frame you have to go back into the door with him, which he almost never let anyone do, and which he did only once, all the way, near the end. At 19, Ray had wanted to fly. That was the whole of the ambition, clean and boyish, the way it always is before the war fills in the details. He had grown up in a flat part of Indiana, under enormous skies, and he had wanted to be up in them, and when the army offered him a path into helicopters he took it without understanding that door gunner did not mean flying so much as it meant hanging out the side of the thing that flew. He learnt the M60 until he could clear a jam blind. He learnt the monkey strap, the webbing that let him lean his whole torso out into open air over the skids, that let him fire down and back along the ship's belly. That meant the only thing between him and the 2,000 feet below was a strip of nylon he checked with his hands 100 times a day. He learnt that the door was not a place you were protected from the war. The door was the place the war came in. And it came in framed. That was the thing he could never make anyone understand later, the specific horror of the door gunner's war, which was that he saw all of it through a rectangle. The infantryman's war was close and chaotic and mercifully partial. You saw the 6 feet around you. Ray saw everything. From the door of a Huey at altitude, the whole country opened up like a map that bled. The paddies impossibly green, the rivers brown and looping, the villages, the smoke, the tracer coming up at him in lazy floating lines that only turned vicious in the last half-second. He saw men running. He saw the tops of trees where the fire was coming from, and he answered it. He saw, on the extractions, the faces of the infantry looking up at the ship as it came down for them, that particular expression of men who are watching their one chance to live descend out of the sky. And he saw the same faces when the ship was too full or the fire too heavy, and it lifted without them. He saw all of it through the opening, at speed, and he could not look away, because looking away was how the gun went silent, and the gun going silent was how everyone died. There was a specific day. There is always a specific day. In February of 1968, his ship went into a landing zone to pull out wounded, and it was hot, the fire so heavy the air seemed to be made of it, and Ray was doing his job, leaning out on the monkey strap, working the M60, when the door gunner on the other side, a kid named Sowell, from Georgia, 19 like everyone was 19, was hit. Ray did not see it happen, because he was facing his own side, his own frame, and that was the cruelty of the position. You could not watch your friend because watching your friend meant abandoning your sector, and abandoning your sector meant killing the whole crew. So he kept firing out his side, into his rectangle, and Sowell died behind him, in the same aircraft, 6 feet away, and Ray learnt about it only when the crew chief screamed it over the intercom and there was still nothing to do but keep firing, because the ship was still in the fire and the gun still had to speak. They flew out with the wounded they had come for, and with Sowell, and Ray sat in his door the whole way back, doing the only thing the door permitted, which was to watch the country stream past the opening and keep his hands on the gun. He never got the sound out of his head, but it was not the gun, and it was not the rotor, it was the wind. The particular sound of the wind through the open door at 100 knots, a vast rushing roar that was the constant soundtrack to everything that happened out there, so that forever afterward, the sound of wind past an opening, a car window cracked on the highway, a door left ajar in a draft, the hiss of a gap, could put him back in the frame in an instant, 19 years old, Sowell dying behind him, the world streaming past too fast to hold. That is what the window was. A window is a frame with the world rushing behind it. A chair with its back to a large pane of glass put an uncontrolled opening behind him, out of his sight, exactly where Sowell had been, exactly where the fire came from, exactly where you must never let the world be if you want to keep the gun on it. His body had learned at 19 a single ironclad law: keep the opening in front of you, never behind, and his body never unlearned it. Not in 50 years, not for a wedding, not for anything. He was not afraid of windows. He was maintaining his sector. He had simply never been told the war was over in the one language that would have convinced him, which was the language his body spoke, and his body had been on watch since 1968. He came home in the summer of that year to Indiana and the enormous skies he had wanted to fly in, and he found he could no longer look at them the same way, because now the sky was the place the tracer came from and the place the ship fell out of. He got a job. He got married to a patient woman named Lorraine, who asked once about the war and understood from his face not to ask again. He worked 30 years at a plant that made truck axles, indoors, away from windows, a fact he never once connected out loud to anything. He was a good man and a quiet one, and he raised 2 kids, and he arranged every room he ever sat in so the glass was in front of him, and he told the little joke, "I just like to see what's coming," and nobody, not Lorraine, not the kids, not Ray himself, ever said the next sentence, which was that a man only needs to see what's coming if some part of him has never stopped believing that something is. The brass casing sat in its dish on the dresser through all of it, catching the light, saying nothing, the one piece of the door he had carried out of the sky. The thing that finally opened him was the smallest thing, and it came, the way these things do, from a direction no one was watching. His grandson, the youngest, a boy of 10 named after nobody in particular, was given a school assignment in the autumn of the year Ray turned 68. Interview an older relative about their life, write it up, present it to the class. The boy chose his grandfather, the way boys do, without any idea what he was reaching into. He came to the house with a spiral notebook and a list of questions a teacher had handed out. Generic questions, the kind designed to be safe. What was your first job? What was the world like when you were young? And one question near the bottom that the teacher had not thought through, because teachers who write these lists have usually not sat in the door of a Huey. The question was, what is something you have never told anyone? Ray looked at that question in his grandson's careful handwriting, and something in him that had been holding a sector for 50 years wavered, not because the boy had earned the answer through any skill, because the boy had asked with a 10-year-old's total assumption that of course his grandfather would tell him that there was nothing a person could carry that wouldn't fit in a spiral notebook, and that innocence did what 4 decades of careful adult silence around him had never managed to do. It made a door that was safe to open. He did not tell the boy everything. He told him about the flying, mostly, the parts a 10-year-old could hold, the sound of the rotor, how you could see the whole country from up there, how green it was. But that night, after the boy had gone home with his 3 pages of notes, Ray sat in his recliner with the glass in front of him where it belonged, and Lorraine found him with the brass casing in his hand, turning it over and over, and he was crying, which she had seen him do exactly twice in 44 years of marriage, and he told her, not all of it, but more than he had ever told anyone, and for the first time the sentence came out that he had spent his life keeping behind the joke. He told her about Sowell. He told her that a boy had died 6 feet behind him, and he had not been allowed to turn around, and that he had spent every day since making sure nothing was ever behind him again, and that he was so tired, he said, so tired, of watching the window for 50 years. Lorraine, who had understood the recliner and said nothing, who had understood the restaurant booths and said nothing, did the thing that mattered. She did not tell him it was over, because she had learned that telling him it was over was speaking the wrong language. She said instead, then let's find the people who speak your language. And she meant it as more than comfort. She had read, somewhere, about the reunions, the crews, the men who had flown those ships, gathering now in their old age, the way the Vietnamese Americans had gathered and the nurses had gathered, the slow, late coming together of people who had each spent decades assuming they were alone in a thing that had in fact been shared by thousands. It took Ray a year to agree to go. The reunion was for his aviation battalion, held in a hotel near an Army Aviation Museum in the South, and he almost turned the car around twice on the drive. He was 69 years old, and he had not been in a room full of men who knew about the door since he was 19. And he did not know whether the frame would hold or shatter in a place like that. He walked into a hotel conference room full of old men in ball caps with unit patches, and a heavy-set man his own age looked at the way Ray came through the door, scanning it, taking the seat that faced it, all of it automatic, and crossed the room and sat down beside him and said, without introduction, "Door gunner, it was not a question. I can always tell. We're the ones who won't sit with our backs to the room." And Ray, 69 years old, felt something he had not felt since before February of 1968, which was the specific relief of being read correctly by someone who did not need it explained. They talked for 6 hours. Ray heard his own life come out of other men's mouths, which is the thing these gatherings do, the thing that breaks the long private spell. He heard a man describe rearranging his living room so no chair faced the picture window, and 3 other men laughed the particular laugh that is not really a laugh. He heard a man describe the sound of wind through a car window undoing him on the interstate. He heard his own sector watching, his own frame, his own 50-year vigil described back to him as a common condition, an occupational injury shared by an entire vanished trade, the door gunners, the men who had spent their war in the opening and their peace guarding against it. He was not broken. He was not uniquely damaged. He was a door gunner, and this was what happened to door gunners, and there were enough of them in one room to prove it. And then a man named Doyle, who had been keeping a list for years the way some of these men did, asked Ray his unit and his dates and the tail numbers if he remembered them, and Ray gave them, and Doyle went quiet and then asked, carefully, whether Ray had been aboard a particular ship on a particular day in February of 1968. And Ray said yes, and Doyle said that he had been the door gunner on the ship that flew the second extraction into that same LZ, 20 minutes behind Ray's, and that he had heard, over the years, from the crew chief who was still alive, the story of the gunner who kept his gun up the whole way out with his own friend dead behind him, and that the crew chief had always said he did not know how that kid had done it, had kept firing, had gotten them all home. "That was you," Doyle said. "I've heard about you for 50 years and I never had a name." And he put his hand on Ray's shoulder, from behind, which no one had been allowed to do in half a century, and Ray did not flinch, because for the first time the thing behind him was not the war. It was another door gunner, keeping his sector. Sowell had a family. That was the thing that changed everything, the last door, and it opened at the reunion in the most ordinary way imaginable, over the kind of paperwork old men bring to these gatherings, the rosters, the unit rolls, the carefully maintained lists of who had been where. Doyle had them all, and when Ray finally said the name out loud, the name he had carried for 50 years without ever speaking it, Sowell, Georgia, the other door, February of 68, Doyle went still and then went to his binder, because Doyle was one of those men who had made it his old age's work to keep the crews findable, and he came back and said that Sowell's people had been located years ago through the battalion association, that there was a sister, that she was still alive, that she lived outside Macon, and that she had been for 50 years trying to find anyone who had been aboard that ship. Ray drove to Georgia in the spring. He was 70 by then, and he had not driven that far alone in years, and Lorraine offered to come, and he said gently that this was a thing he had to do the way he had done the other thing, alone in the door, facing it. He carried the brass casing in his shirt pocket the whole way, the one piece of the door he had kept, and he did not fully know why he was bringing it until he was standing on the sister's porch. Her name was Carol, and she was 73, and she had been 23 when the men in the dress uniforms came up her mother's walk in 1968, and she had spent the 50 years since knowing only the 2 facts the government gave a family, killed in action, remains recovered, and none of the third fact, the human one, the how, the who was there, the was he alone. That was the wound of it. Not that her brother had died, families can carry that. It was that he had died 8,000 miles away in an aircraft full of strangers, and no one had ever been able to tell her whether anyone had been with him, whether the last thing her brother knew was other human beings or only the noise. She had built her life over that, not knowing the way you build a house over a filled well. Ray sat in her living room, in the chair that faced the window, because some things do not change, and Carol, who had grown up around a father who did the same, simply gave him that chair without a word, and he told her that he had been 6 feet from her brother when it happened. He told her the truth, which was terrible, and which was also better than the not knowing, that it had been fast, that Sowell had been doing his job, leaning out on the strap with his gun up, protecting the men below, and that he had not been alone, that there had been a whole crew around him who needed him and knew him, that a door gunner is never alone even though the position is the loneliest in the aircraft, because the whole ship depends on him, and he knows it. He told her the thing he had never told anyone, which was that he had not been able to turn around, that the discipline of the door meant he had kept firing out his own side while her brother died behind him, and that he had spent 50 years being unable to sit with his back to a window because some part of him had never stopped trying to turn around, had never stopped needing to have covered the sector where Sowell was, had been standing that failed watch every day since. And Carol, who might have hated him for the not turning, understood it instead the way only someone who has carried a thing that long can understand another person's version of the same thing. She said the door gunner's job was to keep the gun on the tree line, and that by keeping the gun on the tree line, he had kept the ship in the air, and that keeping the ship in the air was the only thing that could have gotten her brother's body home to her, instead of leaving him in that field forever. "You brought him home," she said. "You couldn't turn around, because if you'd turned around, none of them would have come home, and my brother would have been a name on a wall and nothing in the ground for me to visit. You kept the gun up. That's why I had a grave." And she took his hand, not to shake it, and held it, and 50 years of the wrong story about himself came loose in a living room outside Macon, Georgia. He gave her the casing. He had not planned to, and then he understood, on the porch, that it was hers, that the one piece of the door he had carried out of the sky belonged with the family of the man who had died in the other side of that same door. He put the brass into her hand and told her what it was, the one round he had kept off the floor of the ship, the proof that the opening had been real. She keeps it now in a small frame beside her brother's photograph and his folded flag, the boy forever 19 in his uniform, and the single spent casing from the aircraft he died in, together, home. Ray is in his 70s still. He goes to the reunions every year now, fewer men each time, the way these things thin toward the end. He still takes the seat that faces the door. He still, at a restaurant, at a wedding, in his own living room, arranges the glass to be in front of him, because a body that stood watch for 50 years does not stand down all at once, and he no longer pretends otherwise or hides it behind the little joke. But something changed in the Georgia living room, and it is the thing he tries to give the younger veterans now, the ones back from newer wars, who cannot sit with their backs to a room and do not yet know why. He tells them that the watch they are standing is real, that it comes from somewhere real, that they are not broken but wounded, which is a different thing. And he tells them what Carol told him, the sentence that finally spoke the war's end in the only language his body could hear, that keeping the gun on the tree line was not a failure to turn around. It was the reason anyone came home at all. The country sent a generation of teenagers to sit in the open doors of helicopters and see the whole of the war rush past a frame at 100 knots, and then it brought the survivors home and never thought to ask why so many of them, for the rest of their lives, would not sit with their backs to a window. They were not being difficult. They were still in the door. And a few of them, at the very end, got to learn what Ray learned in Georgia, that the watch they never stood down from had not been madness, but love, the same love that kept the gun up and the ship in the air, and brought the dead boys home to their sisters, still keeping its sector, 50 years after the wind through the open door had gone quiet at last.